My name is Greg Neagle. I work for Walt Disney Animation Studios. And when I tell people where I work, they go, "Oh, are you based in Orlando?" No, I live in California. "Oh, then you must be in Anaheim, right?" No, I actually work in Burbank, California, which is home to endless freeway construction, brush fires, and groundwater that's contaminated with arsenic and cadmium-6, though it is safe by all state and federal standards. This is the building I work in. Today, we're going to talk about imaging. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define imaging as block copying the contents of a disk image file to a disk volume, resulting in a Mac that boots and is fully functional. And MacAdmins have been using this technique for years, sometimes decades, to configure machines to a known state quickly, consistently, repeatably. For a very long time, though, we've been hearing, "Oh, imaging is dead, imaging is dying, or it's just otherwise on the way out." So one of the things that really got people worried about the future of imaging was when Apple started talking about its new next-generation file system, APFS. And a lot of us were worried that once the Mac made its transition from HFS to APFS, that the tools that we were using would no longer be able to create and deploy those images, and imaging would effectively be dead at that point. Well, that turned out not to be the case. Apple has actually updated the ASR tool. It can create disk images from an APF volume. It can restore images. It's changed a bit over the lifespan of Sierra so far. This is part of the man page from 10.13.5. Other versions have slightly different syntax or slightly different gotchas. So make sure if you're not using 10.13.5, check the man page for ASR. But it does work. And because it does work, many of the popular tools like Auto Damage, Imager, and Deploy Studio were updated to either create and or restore APFS volumes or create bootable APFS file systems. But it's not perfect. There are issues. Here on the Imager wiki that we point out a few. But the key issue is that in order to boot from an APFS file system, a Mac has to have the correct firmware, the correct EFI firmware. A Mac that has never had High Sierra installed might not know how to boot from an APFS disk volume. And you could get yourself into a state where you used one of these tools, you restored an APF disk volume to the internal storage of a laptop, and then when you try to boot it, you get the flashing question mark because the firmware has no idea how to boot from APFS. So we realized quickly it became very important to ensure that the firmware was up to date as part of installing High Sierra. And some very clever MacAdmins came up with a way to extract those firmware package from the install High Sierra application, and then able to use those extracted packages in other workflows, and then get those on a target Mac. And the idea was then you would restore an APFS image to the disk, and you would also install the firmware packages. The machine would reboot, the firmware would be updated, and if all went well, you would have a machine that booted into High Sierra. So imaging is not dead, and thank you. Do we have any questions? I suspect, that you probably suspect that there's a little bit more to the story than that. Last summer, Apple posted a knowledge base article, this URL. They posted this last summer, and it was a document on upgrading to High Sierra at your institution or your organization. They discussed a lot of the recommended methods of upgrading. Most of them involved using the installer, the macOS installer. And they pointed out very specifically that they do not recommend monolithic system imaging when upgrading or updating macOS. And we're warned, additional detail here, we're warned that if we use imaging, the Mac may be missing needed firmware updates. And after they published it last summer, they've updated it several times. This is what it looks like as of yesterday. They may have changed it again. There's a new warning to make sure the Mac is connected to the internet when you install High Sierra. And they still warn you away from imaging as a way to install macOS. And just to pile on, Apple has even more documentation on APFS and imaging. In the Mac OS deployment reference, which is here, Apple again warns us away from imaging, and again, Apple points to firmware updates as the big reason. But I'd like to point out that Apple means more than EFI firmware when they talk about needed firmware updates. If you were ever to restore a deployment image to a 2017 MacBook Pro with Touch Bar, when you then boot it, you may see this. And this is it's trying to connect to the internet so that it can download a critical software update. That critical software update is actually the software for the Touch Bar. The Touch Bar, Touch ID are all connected to a ARM chip inside there. They're essentially a second computer, little iWatch or Apple Watch class computer sitting inside your MacBook Pro, and that computer needs software in order to function. And Apple goes so far as to enforce it. It will not let you proceed. You can't skip it and go, I don't care. The Touch Bar can be non-functional. I don't really care. You're not allowed to. It forces you to install that software. And this is all related to the special hardware that's in the new MacBook Pros, the Touch Bar and the Touch ID hardware. The MacBook Pro with Touch Bar is one of the first Macs with special hardware. We have iPhones that have Face ID. We have iPhones that have Touch ID. Is it crazy to think that maybe a future Mac might have Face ID? You know, what will the Mac Pro bring us? You know, it could be something. But it's really clear that Apple is warning us that there's more to making a functioning Mac than just putting bits on the startup disk. There's additional components that need to be set up. Last December, Apple shipped the iMac Pro, and this is the first Mac that supports a new technology, at least new for Apple, called Secure Boot. And iMac Pro's startup is completely different from every Mac that came before it. There's a new chip on the motherboard, the T2, which is yet another ARM-based chip, and it controls the entire boot process. It takes over the functions of a lot of other chips and a lot of other firmware in previous Macs. But it is absolutely vital to the boot process of the new Mac. It's so vital that it can get screwed up to a point that you actually have to take that MacBook Pro, or that iMac Pro, and connect it to another machine and use Configurator to fix the firmware on what's called iBridge, which is the subsystem that the T2 is in. So this is almost a very iOS kind of hardware change here, in that you have to hard cable it to something to restore firmware. If you've ever had to do that with an iPhone or an iPad, it's very similar. And this is not something you can do with imaging. You can't just throw bits on a disk and fix the T2 chip. And again, this is why Apple keeps recommending to us, please use the macOS installer. And this is because the macOS installer not only puts the right bits on the startup disk, but it also updates the EFI firmware. And if the machine has additional hardware, it updates the software for the Touch Bar, Touch ID. It updates the software for the T2 subsystem if it has that. And there are probably other components. I've heard mentioned that the flash storage has firmware that might need to be upgraded, and that the SMC, the Systems Management something or another, I don't know what the C stands for, is another set of firmware that might need to be updated. Imaging, on the other hand, can only put bits on the disk. I'm going to repeat myself again. this is, again, why Apple is telling us to use the Mac OS installer rather than restoring a deployment image. So let's take a step back, and let's look at some typical traditional workflows that MacAdmins have been using to set up Macs for deployment. I think it's really useful to look at the evolution of setup workflows over the last decade or so, just to see where we started and where we came, and that might give us hints about where we need to go in the future. 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I was using monolithic imaging. Is anybody still using monolithic imaging? You have a lot of work ahead of you. I mean, it has its place. It was a thing to do, but transitioning from monolithic imaging to where we need to be in the future is going to be a lot of work. I dug up some slides from a presentation I did 11 years ago. See that great font, the gradient, the 4:3 aspect ratio? I mean, that was the state of the art at the time, graphic design. You might even recognize the names of some of the presenters. But essentially, monolithic imaging boils down to you start with a pristine Mac OS install on a fresh volume. You might have pulled you don't have to use a brand new Mac, but a lot of times people did. And then they would manually create any needed local accounts. You know, they'd run through the setup assistant and create those accounts. And then they'd log in, and they would install all the software that they needed. You know, let's install Office and FileMaker Pro and Now Contact and Now Up to Date. And then they would manually configure all that stuff, go into the system preferences and click stuff and make sure everything was set up the way they wanted, customize it and tweak it until it's perfect. And then you'd have to go through and manually clean it up because you didn't want your web history that you happened to be surfing while you were building the image. You didn't want that to stay in there. You didn't want the trash to still have stuff in it. So you had to go back and clean it up, make sure that there wasn't any stuff left behind that you didn't want there. And that was another manual process. Sometimes people went so far as to writing a script to help them clean that up, and that was good. And then you would create a snapshot or a disk image. You'd use disk utility or something like that. And again, manual process. There were lots of gotchas if you forgot to fix the permissions. Things would be screwy. Many more manual steps. This manual step. And then you'd have to test the thing because you built it from scratch and you might have forgotten a step. And so you've got to deploy it on another machine, make sure everything that you need is there. And then if there was a problem, you'd have to go back and almost, in many cases, start from scratch. But more importantly, when you had to create a new image again in a month or even a year, you had to do all those manual steps again and make sure you did them correctly. So that was one of the big problems with monolithic imaging. It was really tedious, and it was almost impossible to consistently make an equivalent image each time you did it because there were so many manual steps involved. If you didn't do them exactly right, you wouldn't get the same thing. And also difficult if you had like a group of people and like I built the deployment image this year and somebody else has to do it next year. I hope you wrote down good documentation about what you did. There's just so much manual work that your results were really hard to repeat accurately. And the build, test, fix cycle was really tedious. Sometimes you ran into hardware issues. I recall building a deployment image on a Mac Pro, or maybe it was a Power Mac G5 at the time, I don't remember, and then trying to restore that same image to a laptop, and there were hardware issues. You could get past them, you could fix them, but out of the box, it just didn't behave correctly. So a lot of MacAdmins' interest turned to ways to modularize and automate and make images in a repeatable fashion. So let's look at modular imaging. With modular imaging, we start with the OS installer. We add the software that we want to deploy, and we use a tool to compile all that into a disk image. Instadimage was one of the first tools to do that, and that was about 10, 11 years ago. Josh Wissenbaker was one of the main guys behind that. He's at this conference this week, so be sure, if you ever used Instadimage, be sure to say hi and thank him. Later, some people were using System Image Utility. There were ways to use that to build a deployment image. And then more recently, people started using auto damage. Now, you go, is it auto-dimage or auto-damage? I have it from the creator's mouth himself. He likes it to be pronounced auto-damage. So, do people here use auto-damage? So, okay, so it's, actually that's fewer hands than I expected. We'll look at it again a little bit later. But you could take these modules, the modules being the OS installer and packages containing software and configuration, and use a tool like AutoDamage to build a disk image. You then take that disk image and you could restore it to one or many Macs. But that's just deployment. You know, once you deploy the machine, hand it off to a user, stick it in the lab, it needs to be maintained over time. So to maintain machines, you might pick a software management solution, you know, Jamf or FileWave. I really like Monkey. But what you would do then is you would get a bunch of software packages and you would import those into your software management system. And then that software management system would be responsible for keeping the machine up to date or adding additional software later, depending on what your business needs were. But if you look, you might see that there's some duplication of effort here. We see some of the same pieces in two places. So people got to thinking about thin imaging. In thin imaging, you minimize what's in the image, and that's what makes it thin. What you want to do is you still have the OS itself, and the additional packages you add are only the bare minimum required to get the machine talking to your software management system. And the software management system then takes over and does the rest of the install. You can take that a little bit further once you get that working well and go to something that I used to call no imaging. There's no deployment image involved here at all. You simply install those additional packages on a machine fresh out of the box from Apple, and then your software management system, again, takes over and does the rest of the configuration. And a variation on this, which is really useful if you're redeploying a machine or if you don't trust the OS as shipped from Apple. I was told, for example, some of the bigger tech firms, Google, Facebook, because they're so big, because Apple computers are manufactured in China, they feel like they can't trust the OS as it's shipped from Apple, so they reinstall when they get it so that they know the machine is in a known state. I'm not that paranoid, but you know, maybe you are in a situation where you need to be. But in this case, you just reinstall Mac OS, the additional packages, and again, your software management system takes over, installs all the rest of the stuff needed to have a fully functional machine for your environment. So these last few things I've been talking about are examples of installation-based deployment workflows. Previously, we were doing imaging-based deployment workflows. These are installation-based deployment workflows. So instead of restoring an image, you install software in an automatable, repeatable workflow. Not manually. We still have tools that do this for us, but we're installing, not imaging. So you're thinking, wow, that's really tedious. I'm going to have to install Mac OS manually? No. So other than downloading the Mac OS installer from the App Store on each Mac and double-clicking it to install, what are your options for installing Mac OS? One option is using System Image Utility on High Sierra to create a net install image. And we'll take a quick look at what that looks like. Image Utility or System Image Utility is located in System Library Core Services applications. So a lot of people don't know that. It's kind of hidden. It used to be, a long time ago, the only way you could get it is it was part of Mac OS Server. Apple then started shipping it with every client, but they hid it somewhere, and a lot of people don't know it's there. That's where it is. If you launch it, what you would generally do if you're trying to create a net install, you'd pick the Mac OS High Sierra installer, choose to create a net install image out of the three options, agree to the license, and then this is a really important screen for most organizations. This is where you would add your additional packages. This is where you add your customizations. In this case, I've added some packages to create a local admin account, to suppress the setup assistant, because I don't want that running because I have the account, and then just the tools I need to get it to talk to Monkey, and Monkey's going to take over on the first reboot and finish the configuration. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip this. This might work now. It was broken in an earlier version of High Sierra. I haven't bothered to test, but I've heard they fixed it. We can give the network disk a new name and save it out. Most of the time you won't customize this, but this is where you can say this net install image will only boot these particular models. We're going to skip this, filtering. Finally, we get a chance to save it, authenticate, and then we wait. And after a while, we're done. And I saved it to my desktop. It's just a folder full of files. You can peek inside the folder if you want. But you would copy that folder then to your Netboot server, and you can set the Netboot server to offer it to your clients as an option to boot. So I tested this workflow back in last summer during the betas of High Sierra, and I ran into a few issues. The big one was, you might remember I added four or five additional packages to the install to customize it for our needs. And I found that what would happen is the install would start, and then it would stop with a really cryptic error message. And I would poke around at what got staged on the disk for the install, and I found that not all the packages, not all the extra packages that I had said install these, they weren't there. They weren't on the disk. And I couldn't figure out why. I filed a bug with Apple, and then they came back and they said this was a possible workaround, that you could just take all of the component pieces that you wanted to install and stick them in a single package, because one package would work. But if you had multiple packages, it wouldn't work. That was kind of a pain in the butt, and it's really a pain in the butt if you're using any third-party software that's hard to repackage. But I was talking to Apple a little bit more, and there was another workaround they told me about, but I didn't really understand it. Something about make sure you use product build. Okay, I was using that. And make sure that your packages have unique identifiers. Well, yes, of course. I always do that. My packages always have unique package identifiers. That's the thing that ends up in the receipts. They have to be unique. I was very frustrated that they kept telling me this. I wasn't listening, or I wasn't understanding something. It turns out that packages have package identifiers, but the bigger distribution package can have a product identifier. It's a different thing. I had never heard about it until Apple pointed that out to me. So I went back and I started looking at all these other distribution packages that I already had. Third-party ones I'd built, ones from Apple. Some of them had this product identifier. Most didn't, including a lot of the ones from Apple. It was not a common attribute that was set on these. But for whatever reason, the High Sierra installer absolutely required that attribute be set on all the packages. So you can fix it. You can look at if you want to look at a package to see if it has it, you can use the pkg util to expand it. You can peek inside the directory and look at the distribution file and look for that product ID. If it's there, you're in good shape. If it's not, you got to fix it. There are ways to do that. If you have the component packages, which are the individual parts that go into a distribution package, you can build a new distribution package and specify the identifier at the command line. Or if they have an existing package you need to fix, you can use pkg util to expand it. You can edit that distribution file. You can stick an identifier inside there, save the file, flatten the directory back into a package, and that will work. But doing that has another nasty side effect. If the package was signed, when you expand it, edit it, and then compress it again, the signing info is gone. Fortunately, the macOS installer does not currently insist on signed packages. I say currently. I mean, Apple could change that at any moment. I wouldn't be surprised if they did start insisting on signed packages in the future. So that's another possible workaround. I have been told that this whole thing is finally fixed in 10.13.5, that if a distribution package doesn't have a product identifier, the installer kind of makes one up, and it's happy with that. I got feedback from Apple that I should test that, and I just haven't had the time or effort, desire to do that. But I have been told that that's fixed. Unfortunately, there's another bug. If any of the packages that you want to install require a restart, Apple's mechanism ignores them. So what happens is it installs macOS, machine reboots, it installs your extra packages that you've added, and then just goes to either the setup assistant or the login window or whatever. If it requires a reboot, it goes, I don't care, and doesn't do that. And that's a problem for some software. Specifically, since I was using Monkey to bootstrap, Monkey installs launch agents and launch daemons, and the way to make sure those are all loaded at the right time and functional is the Monkey package just simply requires a restart. So normally, in other workflows, we'd install the Monkey packages, it would restart, and then it would bootstrap. The user interface would come up and it would start installing any additional packages. But with this workflow, since it wasn't restarting, none of those launch daemons or launch agents were actually running. So yes, the Monkey stuff was installed, but then it just went to the login window or went to the setup assistant, and nothing ever happened until I rebooted the machine. Again, filed a bug with Apple. They gave me one workaround, put a script in your workflow that loads those things. Okay, great. But I think I've been told that this is fixed in macOS Mojave, but again, haven't tested that one myself to see if it has. So bottom line here is that, yes, net install is a possibility. It might even work for you as long as your needs fit within its limitations. Meaning you've got distribution style packages, they contain a product ID, or at least hopefully Apple's fixed that bug. They don't require a restart for full functionality. Another big thing with the net install is there's no menu of options. Basically, once you boot into it, it just does that thing. There's no way to create a menu where you can go, hey, I want to be able to wipe the machine before I do this, or I want to install Sierra, High Sierra, and the Mojave Beta. I want to have a choice of things to install. Basically, if you want a choice of things, you have to create multiple netboots that can each do a single thing. And then I keep saying netboot. That's a huge limitation for a lot of people right there. You need to have the ability to implement a netboot server in order to use this stuff. So what alternatives do we have? Here's a tool that's included with the macOS installer, and it's currently supported and recommended by Apple. They document it. And Create Install Media is a command line tool. It's embedded inside the Install macOS app bundle, and it can be used to create a bootable volume. For example, you could attach an external USB or Thunderbolt drive to a Mac and use the Create Install Media tool to make that external disk a bootable volume that can install High Sierra. It erases whatever disk you point it to, so make sure you don't just point it to your handcrafted, lovingly archived disk of things that you want to keep forever. But it does warn you that it is going to erase it. It takes a few minutes to copy some files over to the disk. Then if you then open that disk, you might be a little confused because this is what it looks like. It doesn't really look like anything other. You just see this big install macOS High Sierra icon and nothing else. But if you look at it in the terminal, there are hidden files that are the actual OS that's being booted. So this volume works to install macOS, but that's all it will do. Vanilla macOS. There's really no opportunity to customize what's installed. But Armin Bregel clued me into this really cool trick. You can combine Create Install Media and System Image Utility to customize what's installed. So here's what you do. First you use Create Install Media, create that bootable drive that we talked about. Then you use System Image Utility to create a customized net install that contains your additional packages. Once that net install folder is created, inside it is a net install image. You can open that up, and inside it you will find the install macOS High Sierra application, and you can actually drag that into your external boot drive that you created, replacing the existing install macOS High Sierra. Now I think to me this is obvious, but make sure I'm clear about this. They've got to be the same version. In other words, don't use create install immediate to create like a Mojave disk and then try to drag a High Sierra installer in there. But once you replace that and you boot from it and you choose to install macOS, you get your customized install. So it will install macOS plus your additional packages. So that's kind of a cool way to use this tool to have an external drive that can install a customized version of macOS for your machines. There are more alternatives. Now we're going to start getting into third-party and open source things. This is Graham Gilbert's Imager tool. Graham is also at this conference this week. Be sure to go to his session. In fact, I think he's presenting this afternoon. Say hi to him. He's written a lot of cool stuff for MacAdmins. And Imager is an open source application that is designed to run workflows. It's named Imager, so people think, well, it's just about imaging. Well, that was kind of its main focus when it was developed. But it can run any sort. It can run a variety of workflows, not all of which have to include images. It can just install packages. It could run some scripts for you. It has typically been used to install an image, install some packages, maybe run a few scripts, but do the typical deployment tasks in a repeatable way for your users. Last fall, we added support for installing macOS High Sierra. So not just imaging, but running the actual macOS High Sierra installer. And if you're familiar with Imager workflows, this is just a new workflow component that you can add to a workflow. It has to be the last item in a workflow, though. For reasons only known to Apple, the Start OS install tool kind of takes over and forces a restart on its own. So you never get back from that tool. Once you hand control over to that tool, it starts the install, it forces the restart. So that's why this has got to be the last step in a workflow, because nothing more can happen after that. You can still install additional packages, and you can do it without any of the bugs or limitations in Apple's implementation, because what you do is you have Imager sort of stage those on the target disk, but you set them to be actually installed at first boot. So what Imager does is it copies all the packages to the target disk and a script that runs at first boot. And then finally, the final step, again, has to be the Start OS install. So the basic workflow is packages are staged for first boot installation. macOS High Sierra is staged for installation as well. The machine reboots. The High Sierra installer kicks in, installs macOS. Machine will reboot again. The first boot script runs and installs all your additional packages. And depending on how you've set up the workflow, there might be yet another reboot if that's what you want. And so you get a pretty flexible workflow that does what we need it to do. It installs macOS, it installs our additional packages, and if we need that reboot to get everything working, we got it. Imager is typically used from a Netboot image, but it doesn't have to be. You can set up an external disk, an external bootable disk, that will run Imager for you. And it has to be very specially made. And the reason for this is, again, for reasons known best only to Apple, the Start OS install tool will only even let you target volumes other than the current startup disk if you are booted from a kernel that has SIP turned off or a kernel that is ignoring the SIP status. Well, one of those kernels is the recovery kernel, which is also the same kernel you see in net install and in the macOS install environment. So I wrote a little tool. Here's the link. By the way, there's lots of links in this presentation. At the end, I'll give you one master link that goes to my Managing OS 10 blog that collects all the links, and obviously you'll get the slides later as well. So don't feel like you have to write all these links down. So I wrote a little tool, create boot volume from auto NBI. Really great name. People should use it all the time. You point it at an NBI that you would have used with Imager. Imager comes with another tool called Auto NBI, which is written by Pepijn Bruin, who we have lost to Apple. He's a great MacAdmin that wrote a lot of good stuff for us. Now he works for Apple. We will never see him ever again. Actually, he's here at the conference as well. But I actually asked him about some Python thing, and he told me he's not allowed to write Python anymore. And I asked him, well, you can write it in your spare time, can't you? And he's like, yeah. But, of course, since he works for Apple, he has no spare time. Anyway, you point this tool at your NBI and, again, at an external volume, and it just copies some stuff over. And you end up with a bootable volume that will show up in your, in startup disk. If you boot from it, Imager comes up and it runs exactly as it would if you had it on a Netboot volume. So if you're in an environment that either Netboot's not reliable or you can't do Netboot or you want to move away from Netboot, this would be an alternative way to use Imager from an external disk. So tools and workflows we've looked at so far pretty much rely on one of two things: Netboot or booting from external media. So MacAdmins have used these capabilities for years, years, and years. They're fundamental features of the Mac, right? All Macs support these, right? No. No. There's two features of the iMac Pro that make using any of these previous solutions rather difficult. The iMac Pro does not support Netboot at all. And out of the box, the iMac Pro does not support booting from external media. And this is all related to the new secure boot mechanisms. And I don't think it's going out on much of a limb to think that future Macs are going to pick up those same capabilities. So while iMac Pro is insanely expensive, we have exactly one where I work. It's sitting on my desk. And so therefore, a lot of you can ignore them for now because you're like, yeah, we're not going to buy any of those. My guess is future Macs are going to adopt some of this same technology. And so we need to have ways of how are we going to set up these Macs if we can't netboot them, if we can't boot from external media out of the box. Now, external media booting is not completely disabled. All you have to do to boot a iMac Pro from external media is take it out of the box, start it up, wait for the setup assistant, create a local admin account, make sure that it has a secure token. Then you can reboot into recovery, and then you can open up this startup security utility, and then you can authenticate with that local administrator account that you created that had secure token. Then you can turn on external booting. That's all. It's really easy. And of course, it's all completely manual. You cannot script this. You cannot automate this in any way. So have fun. But it is possible. That aside, how can we get stuff on the internal boot disk of an iMac Pro, or presumably any Mac that supports secure boot, that we've just pulled out of the box? There's two ways I know of. One is you can still boot these Macs into target disk mode. And the second is you can boot the machine into recovery. And you can do certain things while in recovery. You do have network. You can attach external USB Thunderbolt devices to it while it's in recovery. Target disk mode I find a little bit problematic on the new machines because you have to have the right cables or the right adapters, and you also have to have a second Mac running the right version of the OS and also having the right connectors on it. And like this cable, it won't work for target disk mode, but this one will, right? So everybody understands the difference between that one and that one, right? It turns out, well, let's look, zoom in, a little bit more. That's why it works, because they put a little label on the cable. Does anybody other than me find the whole USB Thunderbolt 3 cable situation really confusing? Yeah. So if we find it confusing, obviously the other people we work with that maybe have time constraints, they're supporting multiple platforms, they've got to do a lot of stuff, and they grab this cable, looks good to me, why isn't it working? This is just the reason why this one doesn't work is it's only a charging cable. It doesn't even have the additional data lines or something. Was it really Apple? You couldn't spend like 4 more cents to run 2 more wires in there? Whatever. Anyway, I just find it, since it's so unreliable, and you've got to make sure you have the right thing, I decided instead of focusing on target disk mode, at least for my environment, I was going to focus on recovery boot. So I wrote yet another little tool. See, there could be a fun game. How many times does Greg say he wrote a little tool during his presentations? I wrote a little tool called Bootstrapper, and it's just a simple bash script. It's not very complicated. And all it does is it installs packages and scripts you put in a folder next to the Bootstrapper script. And the idea would be that you would put that tool plus the additional packages on maybe a USB stick or a disk image that you host on a web server, maybe. And what's cool about that is if you're hosting a disk image on a web server, now you don't have to worry about making a bunch of USB sticks, keeping them up to date, making sure the right people have them at the right time, finding them when you need them. Oh, I found one, is this the right one? I mean, all USB sticks look the same anyway, right? How do you tell from the outside that that's the one that you need? I mean, that could be, malware that somebody gave you. So I like putting the disk image up on a web server, and what I can then do is I can boot the Mac into recovery mode and bring up a terminal. Now, yes, Bootstrapper is a command line tool, but the only way you're going to run any code at all in recovery mode is you're going to have to open the terminal anyway. You don't get a finder in recovery mode. You can't browse to a disk and double-click an app. You're going to have to open up the terminal anyway. So to me, it's acceptable that this is a command line only tool. So in this case, what we're doing is internally I created a very easy. Well, I think it's easy. Is it easy to remember, Joey? Nah, okay. I have one of my colleagues here that actually has to consume the crap that I produce. But the idea is that you would boot into recovery, open up the terminal, and you could attach. This is the command that you would use to say to the Mac, "Hey, mount this disk image at this URL." So if I go to this URL, I get that disk image containing the Bootstrapper. So it mounts a disk image. And then I can run a script on it. I named it run so that people who didn't have to think too hard. Volumes bootstrap run, because it got mounted on volumes bootstrap. And then, really simple, it says, hey, welcome, I see 2 disks. Which one do you want to install to? I'll pick number 1. And it installs the extra packages, asks me, do I want to restart, shut down, quit? I'm going to restart. Starts up. Monkey takes over, finishes building the machine. So I can take an iMac Pro out of the box. Remember, I only have one, so I've only done this. I actually never have done this. It's only theory, right? Take an iMac Pro out of the box, boot it to recovery, and then by mounting that disk image, I can install these additional images, these additional packages. Again, Monkey takes over. In your case, it might be Jam for FileWave or Absolute Manager, one of those products. And it takes over and does the rest of the install. So I've shown you a few options, a few workflows. Some are using Apple's tools. Some are using third-party and open-source tools. But what is Apple recommending? What is their recommended workflow for the future going forward? Anybody? Yep, you got it. They want us to use DEP and MDM. And I think ultimately they would rather than we don't do anything after that other than use the App Store and be happy. But you can use DEP plus MDM to install additional packages, including your management tools. And Eric Gomez, a Mac administrator, I think he's currently working for Uber, but a little over a year ago, he wrote while he was working for Pinterest, he worked on a project of getting AirWatch and DEP and his AirWatch MDM deployment to install Monkey and Chef so that, again, out of the box, he could leverage those workflows to get his machines deployed. And he wrote several blog posts. He walks you through how you can use the AirWatch as MDM, but the basic concepts can be used with any MDM, well, not any MDM, with many MDMs. And this is because the MDM has to support installing arbitrary third-party packages. Not every MDM does that. Here's a few that do. There's a really popular one that starts with J that doesn't. But if you're using J, you're probably also using their management agent, so it's probably not that big a deal. And when all the pieces are in place, the machine boots up. It sees that it's supposed to talk to an MDM server, so it prompts the user, hey, do you want to automatically set things up? And during that setup, the additional packages are downloaded and installed in the machine. And this is a screenshot from the Pinterest deployment, but then that stuff takes over and finishes the configuration of the machine. Victor Vrenchen, online goes by Groob and WikiWalk. I get confused, these people that have multiple online aliases, but I think those are the two, Groob and WikiWalk. He's a developer. He's spoken at this conference before, I believe, not here this week. But he's a primary developer on MicroMDM. Jesse Peterson is another primary developer on that, and he is here at this conference this week. But he's written a few blog posts on using MDM, which is his open source, or MicroMDM, which is his open source MDM server, to bootstrap install Monkey. And again, you'd use DEP, MicroMDM, which is free plus your labor, which is always not trivial, to bootstrap Monkey, which is free plus your labor. So, big picture, the DEP plus MDM plus more stuff workflow looks like this. Machine boots for the first time. It talks to Apple's DEP servers, and Apple's DEP servers say, I know who you are, at least I know what company your machine is assigned to. You need to go talk to this MDM server over here. Machine gets to the setup assistant, talks to the MDM server, and it displays that, hey, there's a configuration available for your company. User hopefully says, yeah, go ahead. And so the MDM installs some additional things, including some bootstrapping packages for your management agent. In this case, we're going to say it's Monkey. So it tells the machine, go talk to this Monkey server. And the Monkey server then takes over and installs the rest of the stuff. So this is the workflow. Looks a lot like this to me, because there are a lot of moving parts, and many of those moving parts are outside your control. But this is Apple's recommendation for an installation-based deployment workflow. So, is imaging really dead then? No. In the words of Miracle Max, there's a big difference between being mostly dead and all dead. Mostly dead is still slightly alive. So I hope I've convinced you that imaging is maybe not the best general purpose solution for taking a machine in an unknown state and getting it up to date with the current OS and making it work. But there still are scenarios in which restoring an image can be useful. If you know the state of the machine, if, let's say you know the OS is currently running, and that's the same as the image that you're installing, you know that the EFI is already up to date because it was already running 10.13.5, and you know the other pieces are already there because it was already running that. You probably can get away with restoring a 10.13.5 image to that hardware. And you think, well, I don't know if that's particularly useful, but it could be in a lab situation, right? You bought a whole bunch of new machines. They're shipped from Apple. You know they already have High Sierra running on them. You could probably get away with imaging those machines, especially if they're all the same hardware. You know, if it works on one, it's going to work on all of them. This even works on the iMac Pro. You use the High Sierra installer. You need to have at least 10.13.4 or later as a base. You generally get that installer from the App Store, but you do need the full installer and not the stub installer. Sometimes when you download the installer from the App Store, you get a stub. It doesn't have all the parts in it. You need all the parts. And I got really frustrated getting that. So often I would try to get the installer from the App Store, and it would be the stub. And I'd delete it, and I'd download again, stub. And I could not figure out a reliable way to always get the full installer. So I wrote another little tool. And this tool actually uses the stuff that's in Apple's software update catalogs, and it downloads those and assembles those together into a macOS installer on a disk image. So it doesn't install it on your hard drive, it puts it on a disk image for you, which you can then use however you want. So once you have that disk image or the installer, you can download it from the App Store and have it that way. But once you have that install macOS High Sierra installer in any format, you can use a tool like auto damage. So you add that installer to auto damage. You can add your additional packages in that lower pane and let it build a deployment image just like many of us have been doing for years. So really no difference there. You know, if you've used auto damage to build deployment images in the past, basically it's the exact same technique still now. Just make sure you're using up-to-date versions of all these tools. And then you'd start the iMac Pro up in target disk mode and connect it to a host Mac running 10.13.4 or later. You could also do this with an external boot disk, but because of the secure boot, it gets a little bit harder. So that you can do that. Just make sure you have the right cable. Or you might be able to use this cable, as long as you have this adapter. Or maybe this cable will work too. I don't know, I haven't tried it, but it looks like it might. So you get the machine up in target disk mode, connect it to your other Mac, and then you would use ASR restore, source target erase. You're pointing it to your disk image as your source, the internal Macintosh HD volume on the iMac Pro as the target, and for whatever reason, erase is required. If it's so required, why don't you just do it by default, Apple? But they make you do it. They make you explicitly do it. And it works. But just remember, what we're doing is we're taking the Mac from one known state, already booting High Sierra, to another known state. And we're not having to worry about all of the other pieces. All we're worrying about is the bits on disk. So it's a narrower use case, but it is one that does work. Another scenario, I was talking to somebody online about this. They're a consultant, and they supported a very high-strung individual that had a lot of complexly configured software on their machine. It was very specialized software, took a lot of time to configure it exactly the way this person wanted. And they wanted to make sure that if anything happened to that person's laptop, they could restore it to a known state very quickly. And so they made a disk image of the current startup disk of that person's laptop, and they squirreled it away somewhere. And I have no reason to believe that if that person's laptop blew up, he could restore that image because it was made for that machine from a known state to get it back to that known state, and it would work fine. So that's another scenario in which you still could use imaging to do an admin task. So we talked about a lot of things today, and so here's the too long, didn't listen in 5 slides. 1, do not use imaging to upgrade macOS. 2, do not use imaging to bring a Mac from an unknown state to a known state. 3, there are some scenarios in which you could use imaging to set up or restore a Mac, but know what they are. iMac Pro and Secure Boot change a lot of our assumptions about what is available when setting up a Mac. So expect these changes to flow down to other new Mac hardware as it is released. And 5, if you're not doing installation-based setup workflows now, start experimenting with them. You're going to need to know how to do those. You're going to know how to leverage those as time goes forward. I have some recommendations. If you haven't already, modularize your workflows. You don't want a monolithic, handcrafted disk image. You don't want a 5,000-line bash setup script. You want the pieces of your configuration in small bits that you can combine, that you can take out. Oh, these machines, these lab machines don't need this configuration. I don't need to edit a script. I just have to not install this particular package on these. That sort of thing. And that's why I say Apple installer packages are really good candidates for the modules. Apple installer packages can install software, obviously, can put files on disk. They also can run scripts. You can put scripts inside a package. So it's a nice, convenient bag of thing to keep your modules in. And by combining which packages you install, you have now modularized what you're doing. There are some management things on Mac you can only do with MDM these days. And that's going to grow. So if you, like me, have resisted MDM for a very long time, the writing is not on the wall, the writing's passed on the wall, it was on the wall years ago, but I think we're past the point now where you can say, I can get by fine without MDM. I think the only way you can get by fine without MDM is if you never upgrade past Sierra. Might be an option for some shops, but past that, you're going to need some sort of MDM. And a lot of times, one of the advantages of DEP is people talk about zero-touch setup, that you can just give the machine to the user, still sealed in the box, and your techs don't have to touch it at all. They can set it up themselves. Even if you're not interested in that, even if that's not something that your organization is going to do or wants to do in any way, you still want to enroll your machines, if possible, in DEP, and that's for one reason. Could be more in the future, but right now it's one reason, and that's user-accepted MDM. So Apple has tweaked what MDM can do, starting in High Sierra, and it's going to flow down to future OSs. And certain things require that the user has agreed to that MDM enrollment in order for the MDM to be able to do those tasks. What they're trying to do is, if I was a bad person, I could make a game. And that enough would make me a bad person because it would be a bad game. But if I made a good game, or one that at least looked good in the marketing materials, as part of that installer, I could enroll this person in an automated fashion. I could enroll that machine in my MDM, an MDM that I control. So now I've got these people that downloaded and installed my game, and now I also have control of their machines. I could passcode lock it. I could encrypt the hard drive. I could use the ransomware techniques. I could wipe it. There's all sorts of nasty things I could do to a user's machine because I tricked them into enrolling into my MDM. So new features are going to be gated behind this user-accepted MDM thing, and I wouldn't be surprised if some old features like passcode lock, enforcing file vault, remote wipe, that sort of thing, I wouldn't be surprised if in future releases those get moved behind user-accepted MDM. And what user-accepted MDM simply means is the user is involved in the enrollment into MDM. So they could either double-click an enrollment package, they could go into the system's preferences, profiles, and approve it there, or during the DEP enrollment, when they choose to proceed with the MDM enrollment during setup assistant, that's when they've accepted. That's when the user has accepted MDM enrollment. So DEP is a kind of a low touch, from our perspective, way to get the user to agree to MDM. But MDM is not currently a very good tool for installing third-party software. You can't install Adobe Photoshop via MDM. You can't install Autodesk Maya via MDM. Currently, there's still very strong need for additional software management tools other than MDM. So as long as that's there, I recommend that you use those software management tools to do as much of the setup and configuration of your machines as is possible. And if you modularize your setups, it's simply a matter of telling that software management system to install those packages. And finally, things are going to change. They've been changing at an increasing rate. One thing I've seen in Mojave that I'm keeping my eye on is, Apple talked about this in the WWDC. They've added some more privacy controls so that root can't even read like a user's address book or their calendar, that sort of thing. One of the things that was also in that was that there was going to be certain restrictions for systems management, for systems configuration. And I think we may see in the future that certain management tasks that we've done, we're root, we can do it, those are going to be blocked, and users are going to have to approve those as well in some way. Maybe those things can be pre-approved via user-accepted MDM. We don't know yet, but these things are going to change. You need to get up to speed on what secure boot means for your organization. Might be a good excuse to convince your boss to buy you that lovely iMac Pro. It worked for me, might work for you. And if you even want more detail than I could get into today about this, Armin Bragel has written a book, an ebook, Mac OS installation for Apple administrators, and it goes into a lot of detail about the various workflows. It's a good book. Support him. He's done some really great stuff for the community. It was even a bestseller for a day or so. More than Harry Potter. It's amazing, right? So the title of the session, Imaging is Dead, Now What? That's probably not the most accurate title. We should probably call it General Purpose Deployment Imaging is Dead. Please use installation-based deployment workflows instead, but that's a little long. But that's if you want to summarize what we're talking about today, that's it. I've got a link here if you want to get all of the links that I've shared with you during the talk. This will get you to those links. I'll give you a few seconds because I see everybody's got their phone up now that iOS can just basically do that auto-magically, and I'm waiting. I'm not hearing it yet. The giggle, oh, there we go. People fall for this all the time. For those of you in the overflow room or seeing this later on YouTube, I've rickrolled a bunch of people. That URL actually takes you to Never Gonna Give You Up, Rick Astley dancing. The real URL is here. It's okay if you don't believe me. I wouldn't believe me if I were you. And I'll leave that up as now we have a few minutes for questions. So in the back we have the catch box. So if you have a question, raise your hand and then duck when the flying cube of foam heads your way, or at least keep your coffee cup from dumping into your laptop.
So what's your particular rub with the J company?
What's my particular rub with the J company? I have no particular rub with the J company. I think they're fine people. I have friends that work for them. I think they, as the kind of the 500-pound gorilla in the room, I think there are things they could do better, but then that's true of every piece of software. I just want people to know that they're not the only vendor out there, and you should always check your options, because there may be vendors or open source solutions that will meet your needs even better, or not. But don't assume Jamp should not be the default solution for everyone. You should think, you should check on your own what you want to do. Sarah and you got it back there.
Yeah.
Okay.
I watched this presentation that you gave a few months ago at the Mac UK,
Okay.
I believe. You mentioned there that there was a scare last year
Yes.
about how root level agents might be on the way out, but
Uh-huh.
Apple's kind of backed off from that.
And then
For
they
now?
did something this summer that made me scared again. So
I was going to ask, any more insight since the last time you gave this presentation about that?
the only insight that I have is there are changes in the current, in the OS that is currently in testing for release this fall. I think if you're in this room, you need to be testing that now, because if you are finding show-stopping changes, the odds that Apple will address those before the actual release are better the more people communicate with them earlier rather than later. When August comes around, early September comes around, and people are saying, we can't deploy this because blah, Apple's going to be like, the train is rumbling down the tracks, we can't stop it. We have a slight chance this early to deflect them a little bit. But yeah, there are some changes that make me a little bit concerned about certain management workflows, and I don't know what I'm at liberty to discuss at an open forum, so I can't be more specific than that, other than test your workflows that you use to deploy machines now and make sure they continue to work as expected in Mojave. Sarah.
Historically, when I have employee turnover, we take the Mac, we wipe it, we send it back out. Do you think we still need to do that sort of thing, or should we look for a more modular workflow where we can clean up stuff, or is it even necessary?
I would still recommend wiping.
Just use
There's several ways to do that. I mean, if the machine's already running High Sierra and has APFS file system, Apple's added a new erase install flag to the Start OS install tool, which actually, stages the OS installer on a new APFS disk, erases the existing one, and then installs OS. It's kind of nice. Obviously, if you can boot from external media like Netboot or an external drive, you have the opportunity to wipe the hard drive. I could see a future where Apple moves all of the user data and third-party applications and stuff to its own APFS slice, and that all we would need to do is just delete that, and then we wouldn't have to re-clean the machine, deep clean, steam clean the machine before we redeploy it, but we're not there yet. Anybody else? All right. Oh, one more.
So with user-approved MDM and DEP, my question is kind of more DEP-centric because I don't know how many people have had a really bad time with that. Being in higher ed, it's been a nightmare. Is your expectation going forward, if they actually alter the terms that user-approved to be individual user-approved or kind of increase its flow, do you think they're going to maybe bring some of the iOS into DEP import tools to macOS? Do you think they're going to make it any easier going forward to get into DEP?
I don't know. One sure hopes. Apple Business Manager and I think Apple School Manager now are like kind of their new versions of the DEP portal, and I think there's a few more options along those lines, but I haven't played with them enough to say yes or no. And this is why the stuff that I do and the stuff I talk about, I think DEP is something that we should know about and we should leverage, but I personally don't want to rely on it 100%. I need to have a sort of a backup plan when DEP is down or when the vendor didn't put the machines in the portal. You still got to the spice must flow. We still need to get those machines out there, even if Apple's tools aren't helping us at that moment. So I can only hope it will be better because Apple's putting more emphasis there, but I think you should always have a plan B for that sort of thing.
So it sounded like there is an ability to do the Start OS install and then do a flag for installing other packages.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know if that's the same functionality that you found some bugs in? Is it a replication?
It's the exact same functionality,
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the issues that I found in the net install yes, you have the exact same. You did. Again, I don't know the state currently, but for the same OS release, same bugs, both places, because I think it's the same mechanism under the hood. Good question. All right, we've got lunch in 5 minutes. Thank you, everybody, for coming.